Hi, we are Familia number 2, Radhika Neelakantan.
Anaya Resendez.
Chanel Chen. In our presentation, we are going to talk about two of the banned books in the Tucson School District. The first book is called The Fight for Educational Reform by Arturo Rosales, which is Article 13 in the Reader.
This chapter highlights how basic necessities such as education were denied to the Mexican Americans in the 1950s by the U.S. government. This type of education inequality ultimately motivated the Chicano civil rights movement in the 1960s.
Let us take a look at how it all started. In the 1950s, the whites lived in more affluent neighborhoods while the minorities lived in central cities. As Rosales says on page 174, black ghettos and Mexican barrios were now islands in a complex of freeways, tacky industrial parks, auto repair shops, sporting complexes, small office buildings, and expanded airport areas.
The increasing ghettoization made Chicanos feel betrayed by the American dream. As a result, like blacks, many Mexicans gave up on the dream and became more conscious of their own lost identity.
To give an idea of how the civil rights movement was carried out in different ways, we will now focus on the East Los Angeles High School walkout. On March 1, 1968, 300 high school students walked out of their morning classes to protest the cancellation of the play Barefoot in the Park, because it was deemed inappropriate for the students.
Many other inner city school kids also used the walkouts to dramatize the severity of the issue. These walkouts generated publicity throughout the U.S. to examine educational conditions in every community. The Chicano movement succeeded tremendously by instilling a sense of identity, nationalism, and pride in the Mexican American students.
We would like to now examine a quote from James C. Davis, the author of When Men Revolt and Why, on page 195 in the Reader. With rising expectations, people redefine themselves and feel that they deserve more than they have. When people feel that they are treated unfairly, they become outraged. And if outraged people see a possibility of gaining justice, they self-righteously join forces in an effort to get what they believe they deserve.
When high school students read a book about how they were treated as second-class citizens, it might have stirred their innate pride. State officials might have been worried that it will bring about anti-American and pro-Latina sentiment in the impressionable minds of high school students. The official used this type of reasoning to ultimately ban this book.
We would like to ask you now to think about why this book was banned in Tucson, Arizona. Were the educational officials worried about another such revolt or school walkout in Tucson? This book is a historical picture about how educational reform came about for the Mexican Americans and how they had to fight for the right to education.
History, as we know it now, teaches us valuable lessons about how things came about. Banning books denies us the knowledge that we can gain from them. It is important to see to it that Mexican Americans are still not tolerating this type of unfairness today in the banning of their books.
We are now going to shift our focus to another banned book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is Article 15 in the Reader. Paulo Freire talks about two systems of education. He talks about the more common banking concept of education versus the problem-solving concept of education.
On page 72, the banking concept of education is explained by Freire as using the students as containers or receptacles to be filled by the teacher. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. In contrast, in the problem-solving concept, the teacher is no longer merely the one who teaches, but one who is himself taught in dialogue with the students, who in turn, while being taught, also teach. They become jointly responsible for a process in which all grow.
There is nothing objectionable in this book. It is merely a comparison of the two methods of education and weighing which one is more effective in teaching. Paulo Freire is a renowned Brazilian educator, and his methods have been used in many parts of the world to improve teaching.
As an example of the effectiveness of this problem-solving method of teaching is seen in the movie Precious Knowledge. In this movie, the teachers of the Mexican American Studies program use the problem-solving method rather than the banking concept for teaching. They engage in two-way discussions and relate what they are teaching to their personal lives.
For example, Mr. Acosta, a Mexican American Studies teacher, compares hip-hop lyrics to slant rhyme, which is one of the most common terms in literature today. As a result, more students are interested in learning the material that is taught in class, which promotes a higher retention rate and a lower dropout rate.
Frere also states at the end of page 85 that any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. The means used are not important to alienate human beings from their own decision making, is to change them into objects. No one can be authentically human while he prevents others from being so.
When students are forced to learn in a narrative way, they do not learn as much as learning through dialogue and conversation. As students ourselves, we seem to learn better when there is dialogue as opposed to just taking lecture notes and listening to the teacher. Right here in English 1, we are engaging in the problem-solving method by forming familias and learning through discussion and conversation. So we would like to ask you, which way do you learn better?
After analyzing both chapters, we believe that banning books violates our intellectual freedom. Furthermore, we believe that banning books makes people more curious about the banned material, and it ends up being bigger than it was meant to be and has the opposite effect.
The purpose of something being banned is so that people don't learn and ask questions about it. Instead, it seems that when you ban something, it ends up making people ask why it was banned and what was so objectionable about the content that it had to be banned in the first place. It becomes almost like the forbidden fruit.
Hi, I am going to be talking to my neighbor who is a teacher at the San Jose Unified School District, and I am going to be asking her her views on the banning of books, and she is going to tell us from an educational standpoint what she thinks. My first question is, banning of books goes against intellectual freedom of students. What do you think about that?
I think that banning books limits what a child is able to learn in the school and that it is not in their best academic interest.
Do you feel banning books protects or harms students?
I think that banning books will harm students in the future just because it limits what they're able to learn about in the current day, and with the structured support of an educator who can help them guide through their opinions and talk about the different topics that are brought up in the book.
Okay. Have you heard of any books being banned in your school district?
I'm relatively new to this school district, and nothing that I know has been banned in the past 5 years since I've been working there.
Okay. How would you feel if the school board banned a book that you were teaching your students?
Well, first I'd want to know under what reasons it was being banned. Typically it's language, or it's something related to how people are portrayed or certain events that occur in the book. But I think depending on the age of the students that all of those topics can be discussed and addressed in an educational manner so that the books don't have to be banned at all.
As a teacher, just to get your view on the current education system, do you prefer the current system of education where the teacher talks and the students listen, or do you prefer a more interactive approach to learning?
I think that a more interactive approach to learning is better for the student overall because it engages all of their senses, it engages them mentally, and if you can engage them in an activity, it gets their physical attention, it keeps them involved in the curriculum, and allows them to use certain modalities to increase their learning overall. If you're just talking to them, you're going to miss out on about half the students because some of them aren't paying attention. They might be looking at their neighbors who's doing other things.
Thank you so much. That is my neighbor, and we got her opinions about banning of books and some issues on education. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our video.